Here in this video, I will be presenting the story written by an 11th and 12th century monk named Guibert of Nogent about a Britannic king who supposedly met the apostles. This story actually has two sources, apparently. One of them is from the 1300s and is probably based on the first one, which is by Guibert of Nogent, a Benedictine monk from around Paris, around the Clermont region. He was born of minor nobility, and he was raised from a very young age to the monastic life and tutoring and learning. He has an entire autobiography. It's not really an autobiography in a modern sense. It's written towards God, for example, and it seems to serve purposes. It tells miracle stories, things that aren't even related to him, just things that kind of happened in places that he knows. So I won't really go into a lot of that stuff because just read it yourself. But this story was interesting enough to make a video about. So Guibert, you may also know him by his Crusader history that he wrote by talking to returned Crusaders named Gesta Dei per Francos, the Acts of God through the Franks. Guibert is also a great source on the monastic life in that time. We see a lot of things about the monastic life in itself, some of the practices that they had in terms of the dying, or in terms of Mass, in terms of their lifestyle. And he also mentions that there was a sort of monastic drop-off in the late 1100s. He says that around when he was a kid, there was a monastic boom, and that there were lots of people that were in a more pious mindset and joining the monasteries all over the place. But then, at a certain point, it seemed to have fallen away. There were people that just didn't seem to like the excesses of the monasteries, the Benedictines, which was a complaint often made against them by the Cluniacs and eventually by the Cistercians on the Cluniacs and Benedictines. We don't have to imagine that there was a ton of complaints. The complaints, obviously, we think there's a lot of complaints because that's what we're looking at. But the truth is they still had an inner religious life. They still had pious intentions. Just read Suger. Even though they had sometimes a sort of penchant towards prosperity and living well, which some people didn't like, hence why they made more monasteries, or different orders. And for some reason, some scholars have accused Guibert of having an Oedipus complex toward his mother because he does in fact write very highly of her in his work, but if you actually read the work, it's pretty obvious that he even kind of resents her in some ways. He thinks she was pretty controlling, and even though she was sort of caring about him, she also didn't like him becoming an abbot, for example. She even left him to go and be a nun, and left him on his own for a while. In 1104, Guibert had been put in charge. He had been elected by the monks of Nogent-sous-Coucy, which was founded in 1059. There had been a church there prior. Obviously, every one of these towns had a church, and it had been filled with monks in that year. And so about a couple abbacies later, he was selected to be the next abbot. It is partly at this center that the story takes place, which now I will use his words from the English translation of his work, and I will maybe offer commentary as I see fit. The place is called Nogent. As a residence for monks it is new, but its use for worship by worldly society is very old. Even if this opinion were unsupported by any written tradition, it would be sufficiently proved by the discovery of a number of tombs which are clearly foreign and, we believe, not Christian in their arrangement. Around it and in the church itself, there has accumulated from ancient times a great quantity of tombs, and the countless number of corpses piled together is evidence of the great fame of a place so sought out. Since the graves are not arranged in the order usual with us, but many graves are placed around a central one in a circle like a chorus around its leader. And since in these graves are found certain vessels, the reason for which is unknown in Christian times, we cannot help believing that they belong to pagans or are very ancient Christian tombs made in the pagan fashion. This is actually something that the author of this book, it's Guibert, but he has a translator, John Benton, and he has a footnote which actually does acknowledge that In the 1800s, 1880s, there were archaeological excavations, and it proved that this is correct. This is a correct observation from Guibert here. Moreover, in the same church, there is a composition in verse. I should have no authority for resting a case on this, except that very recently I have seen the manifestation of certain things which greatly strengthened my belief in it. This history is related as follows by the text of this writing. Before the assumption into heaven of the incarnate Word, it is said that a certain king lived among the English, who anciently were called Britons and not English, which is a more recent name taken from some of the Saxons who later seized their land. This king of Britain, an oceanic island, was sustained by a great wealth of poetry and philosophy, and besides by a naturally good disposition, he was given to works of mercy. Since he behaved generously to the poor, not out of consideration for God, of whom he was ignorant, but impelled by the exceptionally humane feelings in which he abounded, it was fitting that to the working of a good heart there should be added the gift of a clearer understanding. Pondering very precise arguments, he began to examine what sure divinity he ought to expect in the many forms taken by the gods. He considered what unity in the government of heaven and earth there could possibly be among those who in their marriages, while they lasted, practiced such undoubted unchastity and brawling, and whose earthly dominions revealed cruel hatred of one another, sons against fathers and fathers against sons, going so far as usurpation, exile, and murder. Since the things related about almost all of them were worse than those told about mortals, he thought it complete madness to ascribe to them rule over the earth, much less over the heavens. Who would hand over the disposal of things on high to those whose miserable power could not control the smallest portions of the earth without disgraceful deeds? Now this is an interesting observation by Guibert, not really an observation, but just part of the story he heard, because he says that the deities, the gods, are actually men that ruled kings, knights in ancient Britain, that once they had died, they had gained the status of divinity. Maybe even while they were alive, but that part isn't too clear. So, this isn't like in, say, the Mediterranean, where you have Roman paganism, Greek paganism. It's just paganism. There's no such thing as either of those two. It's just one thing. I mean, I don't think if you talk to a Roman pagan and you said, we'll call him Roman pagan for these purposes, and you said, hey, you believe that there's Jupiter. Is there another god that's Zeus? He'd probably say, no. Right? They're the same thing. So, in that same sense, they're the same religion. But these guys, they had deities that were, I think they were supposed to be physical, sort of embodiments, maybe, of the All-Father God. But they were still more, they weren't so earthly, fleshly. There's a big difference between, like, Hermes and Aphrodite and that sort of thing, and, like, your former king who just died and now he's a god, right? There's a big difference there. Now, why was this the case? Maybe it was just because they had a sort of primitive understanding of the supernatural. Maybe they had, it could even be a way of authority. If you have your king is a certain way, and this respect for the divinity of a king probably extended into their own lifetimes. They probably, I think this is also, I've heard this is seen in St. Patrick's hagiography. So, the kings had a sort of, and you could say the same thing about, like, Western Frankish kings too, when there was sacral kingship. They could do miracles, cure scrofula. But this is, in a sense, different because these guys have, so the Frankish kings, for example, were more, there was still one god in heaven, but then these guys had power through him versus the kings of the Britain lands who actually were gods in themselves. And so they must have had a sort of don't mess with me kind of, or don't disobey. It might have been a way to maybe just not a way to, in a sort of modern, like, you can imagine how conspiratorial this could get, right? They did this because they wanted to control, but maybe it was just more of a natural development. Maybe it wasn't so much like there was a whole plan to do this and then they implemented it. It probably just happened over time, however it did, if it even is true in the end of the day. And so that's why maybe he was saying that there were divinities that were men, and he is saying that anybody who acted in a brutal way, and we can imagine Guibert saw these people. I mean, he even talks in his writing about his brothers being. Guibert is he's very self-deprecative. He very much says, oh, I'm a horrible sinner. I've done terrible things, but he's also very easy and very quick to just rag on his brothers for being, debauched, or his cousins too for being debauched and going and killing and plundering and not studying at all. And that's actually why he actually says he was glad that his father had died, because so Guibert, when he was born, he was very small and he was very early, I think. And so what they did was they put him, the baby, at an altar dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and they pledged Guibert to her and said that he will be a monk or a cleric. And so he definitely didn't want his father there to sort of break that oath to the Virgin Mary and make him become a knight. So Guibert lived up close and personal with these knights. He even talked. That's how he got his story about the crusade. He talked to knights that went down there, and of course they were much more, praised for their works in the East. But these people still lived around him at the time, in his own vicinity. So there might have actually been some kind of projection of his own mentality against these kinds of people in this story, even though if it is true in some degree, there were definitely knights or cavalry that were doing a lot of damage even in ancient Britain. This is how the world worked back then. Back to the story. While the man pondered these and similar things, shutting out of his heart the images of these vain gods, as he thought them, he turned to the worship of one incomprehensible being, who ought to be adored under no form, who alone with single conquered governs all things, whose invisible things he had understood through the things that are made. When in the course of these profitable reasonings he still hesitated in some doubt, God, who declares better things to men of good will, sent a voice from heaven to urge the man to go to Jerusalem, where he would hear what ought to be believed about God, how the Son of God proceeded from God and lived among men for their sake, what he endured, what became of him, and what vicars of his divine nature he left behind as models. He was told that when he had gone there, the mother and all the apostles would explain these great mysteries to him. After this trustworthy prophecy had been delivered to him, the British king put aside his possessions in his kingdom and determined to hasten to put what he had learned to the test. And so he left the country, prepared a fleet, crossed the Channel, passed through the territory of many towns and cities, and came to the borders of the province of Laon. In the rural locality we previously called Nogent, he stopped for hospitality. Now, Nogent lies below a castle named Coucy, which was built recently because of foreign invasions, reportedly by the country folk of the region, very proud and wealthy people. The castle, therefore, has no ancient history at all. Guibert seems to have come from the area of Breteuil, so it makes sense that he would be kind of digging at his rivals in Coucy a little bit, even though he sort of was, afraid and aghast by the pretensions of the knightly classes. He still had familial ties and links, trust, friendship, and so it would make sense that he would, call Coucy built by Rustiches and say that it had no ancient history, which maybe it did, maybe it didn't, who knows. The place of which we are speaking at the time lay near woods full of wild beasts for hunting in the river we mentioned above, the Ayet. This river is of greater value than size, for it surpasses others more famous streams in its wealth of fish, and it is not confined within the passage of its channel, like other rivers, but spreads out into wide stagnant pools like fish ponds. The slopes of the hills that rise on both sides are covered with vineyards, and since the soil is suitable for both Bacchus and Ceres, the land is praised for producing all sorts of crops, while its productive stream is admired for its pleasant meadows stretching far and wide. According to an old tradition which is firmly established, there was in that place a very ancient temple, not dedicated to the name or honor of any existing god, but consecrated to a woman not yet born, who should bear one both God and man. It was therefore dedicated to the future mother of God yet to be born. No wise man thinks this absurd, for since they worshipped an unknown god at Athens, They were certainly aware that he would be born of a woman like their ordinary gods, whose mothers they name. And if a shrine was dedicated to one about to be born, his mother, like those of the others, was not likely to be deprived of a similar honor. What should be believed in the case of the one to be born could also happen to his mother. To this place the British prince happened to come, and thankful that he had reached so pleasant a country, he decided to rest himself and his followers there, worn out as they were by the hardships of their journey, and he gave the pack animals a week to regain their strength in the neighboring pastures. So here Guibert decides to relate what we find in Acts 17, verse 23, about the altar to the unknown God, by relating it to the altar to the woman who was supposed to bear the one true God. Also, Guibert mentions that the god would be born of a woman like their ordinary gods, whose mothers they name. So he's still saying that this British... Remember when I said about the gods being born and being men on earth and then being divinitized, so to speak, in the future? Well, this is kind of the same thing. He's making the same claim that even in this place of... It's not called Nogent at that point, but that area in Gaul, near Laon, he's saying that they had the exact same thing, that their gods were born of women. So it isn't absurd to say that, this one god would also be born of a woman, but he would actually be God and not just some man. He would be man and God. This is where in the footnotes the translator of this story says, quote, "The better-known story of the foundation of Chartres as a pagan temple dedicated to the Virgin does not appear before the 14th century." And he cites, if anybody really wants to look at it, Dictionnaire d'Histoire et de Géographie Ecclésiastique 12,550. So if that says something to you, then check it out. So it seems that actually Guibert's is the only source talking about Nogent being such a pagan temple dedicated to the Virgin. But another story from the 1300s says that it was actually Chartres. So maybe there's a relation, maybe there's a conflation, maybe there could be some relation in the stories. Guibert probably heard this from somewhere. He might have made this whole thing up, but he also might not have. He doesn't seem to be somebody who makes things up. He may have been misinformed or just heard a local legend. Going on from here and covering great distances by land and sea, at last he entered the walls of Jerusalem. Recently the Savior had suffered, risen from the dead, and ascended into heaven, and the Holy Ghost had been given. He therefore found the city divided into opposing factions, some being angered at what had happened, others rejoicing. He had no difficulty in finding those whom he sought, for the great publicity given to the matter readily revealed those who were spreading the new law. At this point, they were not held in the usual imprisonment, and the fear of Jewish treason did not prevent them from bearing witness to the Lord, but he looked upon them as outstanding among the people, so that the evidence of their status fulfilled the authority of the word. Why prolong the story? He found Peter and the 11 among multitudes of people, with a very large gathering of disciples attending them, along with Mary, that mirror of all our faith and glory, who was graciously present there and bore testimony to the divine incarnation. Addressing them in the Virgin Mother, the British king, who was soon to offer first fruits to God, thus set forth the reason for his journey. "You see, fathers and lords, I have come from the remotest ends of the earth to listen to you. Following in the right line of succession, I have till now ruled over the Britons. Although up to now I observed these customary rites, which through the ages of their error they have regarded with veneration, I have recently abandoned these observances for the following reason. When I considered those whom the ages had honored by ascribing to them divine being, reasoning it out that they were the worst of mortals, and that after their monstrous abominations they had paid the debt of nature, by reasonable conjectures I concluded that men who had lived poorly on earth, exalted above others by reputation alone, as gods could in no way have created the heavens and the earth, and all the things therein, which manifestly have waxed strong in this world from the mildness of the sky and weather and the abundance of the earth. After reason had destroyed their divinity, at last I reached the settled conviction that since they had finally been deprived of their divine authority, the unique creation and rule of one God could exist, and that as all things come from him alone, so he, containing all things in himself, holds the universe together, and that this ought to be believed. After my mind had become fixed upon one God, and I had scornfully rejected the temples and their idols forever, My heart seemed to be cleansed from the filth of idolatry, and the celestial purity of the unique true religion shone forth in it. Soon a voice from heaven ordered me to come here, where in the dispensation of God the Son, who has recently suffered, I have been promised that you will deliver to me the truth of the only faith. By this Mother of the Light which was announced to me, whom I see present, and by your offices I beseech you to instruct me in the mysteries of this new birth. Hearing this, Peter and his rejoicing colleagues, along with Mary, who shed glory on that heavenly assembly, worshipped the greatness of God and the Son of Man, who had just bestowed salvation at the world's center, and had not yet scattered about the interpreters of his grace, but now so suddenly poured out the declaration of his new bounty to the limits of its western parts. When the rule of faith had been delivered to the man, and he had next been washed in the water of baptism, he received the name of Quilius. He was then confirmed by the schooling of these great teachers in the understanding of that sacrament which he had received. When he was about to leave them and return to his own country, he begged them with a faithful heart for the sacred pledges of relics, that is, some of the things which he had learned had touched the body of the Savior. With pious devotion he asked for and took portions of the cords by which he knew the Lord had been fastened to the whipping post, of the scourges with which wicked hands had furrowed his blessed body, of the crown of thorns which had circled his holy head, of the very wood of the cross on which he had hung, of that garment of the Mother of God in which it is said she had brought forth the Lord, and of the clothing of all the apostles. Treasuring these things in a small reliquary which he carried with him, he faced the difficulties of the return trip. After he had passed through the intervening regions, he came to that countryside where he had stayed to rest before. There he was suddenly seized by an unexpected illness, and when he had taken to his bed, it was revealed to him in a dream that in that place the end of his present life was at hand. He was also told that his body must be buried here, and that the relics which he had received from the holy apostles at Jerusalem were to be buried under the same turf. On awakening, this warning of his death turned the man's thoughts from everything else to this one subject, and he busied himself with the last needs of his dead body in the hope of a glory soon to follow. And so he died there that day and surrendered without loss to him, who gave it that which had been entrusted to him. There, under the soil of the tomb where his body was put to rest, the coffer of relics found a place beside him. Long afterward, by God's care, the box was taken out and enclosed by some faithful persons in a costly shell of gold of ancient workmanship, its visible evidence descending to this age to provide fresh testimony for the old story. These are said to have been the origins of the place. Now there is one tell here that Guibert either was making this story up, which he probably wasn't making it up entirely, but that he had a huge part in influencing it and putting his own twist on it, is that the king had no relics of Christ's body at all. Because usually you would have relics of, say, Christ's hair, or maybe a cloth with his blood on it. But Guibert, as we see in his other writings, was actually really against any kind of he didn't even like really the relics of saints that had been taken off of their bodies, because, you're taking the saint's body apart and then spreading it around as relics. He didn't really like this. He thought it made him kind of queasy, it seems. And so other people were obviously doing this. That's why he was upset about it. So since others were obviously doing this, that it made him queasy about it in the first place, that just means that it would have been done. And since it wasn't done in this case, that the king only brought back relics of, say, rope or that sort of thing, then that just means that Guibert wrote which relics he kind of wanted the king to bring home, not the ones that he actually did bring home. So maybe in the actual story he brought something else home, and then Guibert disagreed and said, no, that's not a good thing, or maybe that didn't happen because I don't like that. And then he gave him different relics instead in the story. We don't know, because we don't have any other account of the story, it seems, anywhere. The story of King Quilius is completely just, it's not on any records we can find, it's not in Venerable Bede, it's not in any mythical, it's nowhere. It doesn't exist. So, did this happen? Did it not happen? We don't know. It's completely lost the time. But it's still an interesting story that I figured it'd be good to share here. So, if you're still here, thank you for listening, and goodbye.